Hi everyone and welcome back. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who commented on my booktube newbie tag. You were all so kind and so welcoming and it's made me feel so much better about this whole thing, so I just wanted to say thank you. I really appreciate it. For my first proper video, I thought it would be a good idea to do a kind of recent reads video so you can get an idea of the kind of things I've been reading recently and what I thought of them. So the first book I'm going to talk about is Elm It by Fiona Mosley, and this is actually a debut novel by Fiona Mosley. They made it onto the Man Booker shortlist this year, which is pretty amazing. This novel primarily tells the story of Daniel and Kathy, who are siblings and live in the middle of nowhere, secluded from the local town, with a man that they call Daddy. The house the family live in was built from scratch by Daddy's bare hands. Because they live isolated from the local community, they hunt and forage their own food. In this novel, we see their unusual existence become threatened as local greedy hostile men turn against them. I found the characters in this novel to be really interesting, especially Danny and Kathy, because of their unusual existence. They were taken out of school really young and then were isolated from other people their age, so it's really interesting to see the way they were turning out. Daddy was also quite an interesting character that we didn't really know much about. He was a very violent man, and we knew that because he often fights for money and has this anger that bubbles inside of him. He was really interesting as we didn't know much about him, about his backstory, and so I did find myself wanting to know more about why he was the way he was and lived the way he did and took the children out of school so young. That being said, the character development did fall a little bit flat for me, which is such a shame because I thought it was really interesting, the idea of these characters living isolated for the local community. I really would have liked to have seen how that affected them more. And I also felt the pacing of the story to be a little bit backloaded. I found it to be a little bit off. Throughout the story, we're working up to a point where all of the aggravation with the local men comes to a head, and I was really anticipating that point, but when it did come, I found it to be a little bit disappointing. And I also felt that far too much happened right at the end of the novel, when I would have liked to have seen it spread more evenly throughout. The best aspect of this novel for me was definitely the writing. Fiona Mosley has a really distinct writing style, and she doesn't shy away from often grotesque and kind of visceral imagery, which was really interesting. Ultimately, Fiona Mosley managed to create an eerie atmosphere that was almost gothic, which I really enjoyed. So while I did not absolutely love this novel, I was impressed by many of its aspects and totally understand why Fiona Mosley made the shortlist from the Man Booker this year because of her distinct writing style. So in the end, I gave this novel a 3.5 out of 5 stars, and I can definitely see how Fiona Mosley is going to develop as a writer. Another book that I read recently was actually a poetry collection, and that was The Sun and Her Flowers by Rupi Kaur, which followed her debut poetry collection, which came out last year, which was Milk and Honey. I really loved Milk and Honey last year when I read it, so I was really looking forward to getting round to this one, but that being said, I was slightly disappointed in it, which was a massive shame. I do want to start by saying that I really do recommend Rupi Kaur as a poet. For somebody who doesn't read much poetry and wants to read something that's emotive but also accessible, she's really great for that, but also somebody who just wants to read a bit of feminist poetry. She talks about topics such as self-worth, relationships, love, and she really is somebody who is brilliant at what she's doing. In terms of this collection though, I did not find it to be as good as Milk and Honey. I thought that a lot of the poems were extremely similar to that in Milk and Honey. Some of them I even found to be rewordings of particular poems in Milk and Honey, and I actually went back and checked them and they were very similar, so that really disappointed me. I was really hoping for something new and distinctive from this collection, but I didn't really feel like I got that. That being said, there was a small section in the middle of this book that discussed Rupi Kaur's family, which was unique to this collection, and it primarily discussed her mother and her experience as being a first-generation immigrant in the UK coming from India. I found the poems in that section to be really rich and insightful, and I've not read any poetry like that before, and Rupi Kaur also touched on other themes such as the wider refugee crisis that's facing the world today, which I thought was really brilliant. Ultimately, I would have liked it if she'd included more of that kind of poetry and focused it more on that, rather than poems that are extremely similar to her first collection. I think that would have been much better. So overall, this poetry collection was really good because Rupi Kaur's really good, but I'd say if you do want to check her out, then check out her first collection, Milk and Honey, because I found that ultimately to be better. If you have read Milk and Honey, you might find some of the poetry in this quite repetitive, but I would recommend it for the middle section when she talked about her family and the culture they come from, because I found that to be really interesting. So in the end, I gave this poetry collection a 3 out of 5 stars. Another novel that I read recently was The Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry, which is a historical novel set in the late 1800s. The novel follows Cora Seaborn, who is newly widowed and moves from London to a small Essex village with her son and friend Martha. Here the three characters make friends with the Ransom family, while slowly rumours start to spread around the village that the fabled, mysterious and murderous Essex Serpent has returned to the marshes. This novel kind of focuses on the way that the town responds to these rumours of the Essex Serpent, and it was really interesting to see the way that individuals were responding differently from each other and the way the community as a whole went into a kind of hysteria. I really loved the strong themes of science and religion that ran throughout this novel. The two main characters, Cora and her friend Will, kind of represent opposing sides. So Cora wants to answer the hysteria in the town with science, while Will wants to answer it with faith. This was really, really interesting, especially due to the time in which it was set, when scientific discoveries were definitely on the rise and people were starting to turn more towards science than religion. So I did think that this novel had really, really interesting themes, which I really appreciated. And Sarah Perry also succeeded in creating a really dark and gothic atmosphere. Dark and gothic reads seem to be a bit of a theme for me as of late. But ultimately the characters fell a little flat for me, which was really disappointing. I found myself really enjoying the themes that were running out much more than actually caring about the characters. And I liked the characters for what they represented much more than actually caring about them as individuals. As I mentioned in my first video, character development is a really huge thing for me, so because I couldn't quite connect with the characters, that really did hinder my reading experience, which was a shame. Overall, I would recommend this novel if it sounds interesting to you. Sarah Perry did manage to create a really great atmosphere, and some of the themes that she explored were really, really interesting. So overall, I gave this a 3.5 out of 5 stars. The final book that I'm going to talk about that I read recently was The World's Wife by Carolyn Duffy, which is a poetry collection, and actually the first poetry collection I've ever read by Carolyn Duffy. This poetry collection has a brilliant premise, and what it does is it gives voices to the women that were behind lots of men in history and myth, and we get to see the stories that we all know so well told from their perspectives, which is hilarious. I found this collection to both be extremely humorous and sharp, but also very thoughtful and subversive, which I really appreciated. Among other people, we have poems about Queen Kong, Medusa, Mrs. Darwin, and you'll definitely recognise a lot of the names that come up in here. I really want to read you quickly the poem about Mrs. Darwin because I think it sums up this poetry collection brilliantly. Mrs. Darwin, 7th of April, 1852. Went to the zoo. I said to him, "Something about that chimpanzee over there reminds me of you." That's hilarious. As well as being really quick-witted and entertaining, this poetry collection also explores deeper themes such as innocence, deception, and relationships. A lot of the poems are really impactful and often quite emotive and explore themes that are still relevant to this day, and so I really, really appreciated that. And also, on rereading the poems, I also got more out of them. One of my favourite poems in this collection was Little Red Cap, which is a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood, and deals with themes such as innocence and power imbalance, which is really, really interesting. One of my favourite parts of the poem was this bit. Lesson 1 that night, breath of the wolf in my ear, was the love poem. I clung till dawn to his thrashing fur, for what little girl doesn't dearly love a wolf? Then I slid between his heavy matted paws and went in search of a living bird, white dove, which flew straight from my hands into his open mouth. One bite, dead. How nice, breakfast in bed, he said, licking his chops. So overall, I thought this poetry collection was brilliant on so many levels. However, I did enjoy some of the poems more than others, but I suppose that's to be expected with any poetry collection. So overall, I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars and I would highly recommend it. So that's 4 of the books I read recently. I hope it gave you some kind of an insight into the kind of things I like to read, and I hope you really enjoyed hearing my thoughts about them. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'd be really, really interested to see what kind of things you've been reading recently and whether you'd recommend them or not. So if you'd like to comment down below and let me know, I would really love that. Bye.